Assembly, UN member states will today adopt a declaration committing to a re-invigorated multilateralism in a world that needs cooperation and consensus. Let's listen in.
Basic human right, which is a first line of defense against pandemic. 150 million people in the region cannot afford decent housing. With the UN regional system, UNEC supports countries to close those gaps.
The integrated spirit of the 2030 Agenda is at risk in Latin America and the Caribbean region. While a few SDG targets have already been met at the regional level, others will only be achievable with strong policy interventions. Available data shows progress in achieving some SDG targets, but sustained efforts are required for others.
Inequality defines Latin America and the Caribbean. Wealth, income, social protection, education, knowledge, and skills are in the hands of the few. Progress made on eradicating poverty have been set back more than a decade in a matter of months. ECLAC estimates a GDP contraction of minus 9.1%, with a rise of poverty up to 231 million and 96 million in extreme poverty. Governments have provided emergency basic income to the poor and tax exemptions and grace periods to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. ECLAC proposes to extend these measures for 9 months. We also propose a basic digital basket comprising a laptop, a smartphone, a tablet, and low-cost connectivity for households without internet. We need a political, fiscal compact to ensure universal social protection.
Africa is not on track to meet most of the Sustainable Development Goals. Even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Africa was not on track to meet any of the targets of SDG 1 to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Of particular concern are the efforts towards achieving SDG 5 on gender equality. More than half of the measured climate targets would not be met unless progress accelerates.
In the last decade, Africa has made progress in reducing poverty. However, 300 million Africans still live below the poverty line. With COVID, 400 million vulnerable Africans may fall into poverty, and that will see us at about 700 million Africans falling into poverty before the end of the crisis. Africa is in its first recession in 25 years. Governments will need to support the process of getting people out of poverty. We will need to do two things. The first, social protection programs. Today on the continent, we spend about $6 billion on social protection programs. We will also need to do job creating programs to ensure that particularly the youth who have fallen into poverty and are more resilient can find jobs for themselves and work their way out of poverty.
While women across Arab countries are making great strides in society and the economy, the region also has the highest level of female unemployment globally and one of the lowest levels of political participation.
Violence against women is on the rise and costs the region an estimated $245 billion. Arab countries should focus more on empowering women economically, continue to do away with social discrimination policies, and create opportunities for them. Embracing technology and creating enabling platforms that support, fund, and scale up businesses powered by women is key. Incentive measures are also needed to link women's small businesses to the region's top businesses through integrated value chains. Investing in women is critical to achieve stable, just, and prosperous Arab societies.
The pandemic risks undoing years of progress in gender equality. Millions of women's jobs in the informal sector have disappeared. Unpaid care work has increased exponentially. Thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises have closed, many of which are run by women.
Rising to the challenge of gender inequality makes the commitment of the Beijing Declaration ever more important. We are witnessing this momentum of change in the Asia-Pacific, lifting their barriers to political participation and leadership, ensuring women's economic empowerment and integration into formal economy, developing gender-responsive and inclusive social protection, and ending violence against women and girls. These are central to our commitments to achieving gender equality in Asia and the Pacific.
For gender equality, the UNEC region has made important strides towards targets on maternal, sexual, and reproductive health. But the COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately affected women both at work, where a quarter of women are in precarious jobs, and at home. Violence against women and girls has surged dramatically. decades of progress on the empowerment of women are at risk. I encourage all stakeholders to join UNEC's efforts to promote the use of gender-specific standards. I call on governments to support women-owned small businesses to drive the recovery we need for the SDGs.
The crisis precipitated by the pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on women, who bear the brunt of an excessive burden of unpaid work, increased poverty and job insecurity, limited access to public services, and insufficient financing for gender equality policies.
Women are worse off than men in terms of discrimination, political exclusion, and lack of economic autonomy. Violence against women and girls is the tragedy of inequality exacerbated in these pandemics. The crisis is affecting women more severely as they account for more than 60% of informal labor, and confinement is placing additional pressure as primary caregivers, paid and unpaid. Women are on the front line of the response to the health crisis and are more exposed. They account for 72% of those employed in the health sector. Public care systems are being considered by the region based on examples of Uruguay and Costa Rica to open labor options for women. The region has performed well in equal education for women, which in fact reaches tertiary education more broadly than men. However, there is a need to improve their economic autonomy through access to high-quality jobs, equal pay, and financial inclusion.
90% of Africa's women work in the informal sector, and 70% work on cross-border trading or earn their incomes from cross-border trading. To ensure that these women can continue to be prosperous, one is to give them an identity. Informal economies do not generate prosperity. So finding ways of formalizing their businesses and ensuring that they become fully contributing members of societies is going to help achieve gender equality. On cross-border trading, the main and most important element, particularly for women businesses, is to ensure, one, that they have access to financing, but secondly, that we can harmonize processes to ensure that when women trade across borders, Africa has 76 borders, that they meet and confront the same kinds of regulatory environments. With the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and the prospect of harmonizing cross-border trading, we hope that we can move further into gender equality on the continent.
Economic growth in Asia and the Pacific has been coupled with increasing vulnerabilities to climate-induced disasters and rising environmental degradation.
When it comes to climate and environment, our region needs acceleration across the board. It means moving towards decarbonization by 2050, a rapid end to fossil fuel subsidies and new investment in coal, tackling air pollution, transforming to green and smart infrastructure and transport, investing in new technology and big data to prepare and respond better to disasters, conserving and protecting our oceans. Part of this transformation have started to take shape. Countries are working on their national roadmap for SDG 7, increasing the share of renewable energy in their energy mix, switching to the use of clean cooking fuels, strengthening regional cooperation for sustainable oceans. We now look to the SDG moment to set course for the future, one that is inclusive, gender equal, and green.
The Arab region registers the highest temperatures on record, reaching 55 degrees, with 5 more expected by the end of this century. Water and land resources are already strained. Nearly 87 million people lack access to drinking water. The region has already committed to increasing the share of renewable energy in its energy mix and needs to adopt integrated water management policies. However, financing remains a challenge. Exploring new financing means, such as debt for climate swap, is an option. Now is the time to integrate climate action into national planning. People cannot wait, and the planet cannot wait. Accelerating SDG implementation is our way forward.
With its high material footprint, the UNECE region must make its resource use more sustainable. Recovery packages must mobilize investments for the future, fully aligned with the green transformation needed to address climate change.
The region generates some 40% of GDP, but only 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. This shows the region has made some progress towards decarbonizing its economy. The region must further reduce energy use, buildings' energy needs, produce 40% of CO2 emissions. Improving building energy efficiency can deliver massive climate gains and create millions of jobs. Countries must reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and accelerate investment in renewables and low-carbon technologies. As we enter the last 10 years of Agenda 2030, I invite all governments to work with us to make the circular economy a reality.
Our region contributes only with 8.3% of global emissions, yet is highly vulnerable to climate change. Climate action should be the driving force to recover and build back better with job-intensive and carbon-free investments. Our region pledged a collective target of 70% renewable energy by 2030. Investment in renewable energy sources jumped 65%. In Brazil, expansion of wind power mobilized 8.2 million and created 250,000 jobs. Costa Rica, Chile, and Uruguay committed to become carbon neutral in 2050. ECLAC is advocating for debt reduction for resilience in the Caribbean and the creation of a Caribbean resilience for adaptation. In Latin America and the Caribbean, building back better means reshaping development with equality and sustainability.
Over 3 to 5% of Africa's GDP is lost because of climate change. There are two areas where Africa can contribute to the reduction of CO2 emissions. The first is agriculture. The second is energy. In agriculture, two policies that we can put in place. The first is reduce extensive agriculture, do more intensive agriculture, but increase productivity, which will increase yields, add an additional $100 billion economy and create 40 million jobs. In energy, Africa today is clearly energy deficient. Over half of our population does not have access to energy. More importantly, industry does not have access to make it competitive and trade globally. Therefore, we will need to produce more energy. Africa has 22,000 megawatts in its national determined contributions. We hope to find financing to do that. That is why Africa is asking for $100 billion to help it get out of the COVID crisis and special drawing rights to help ensure that we can continue to finance the private sector to ensure that Africa grows back better from the crisis.
Coming out from this pandemic greener will require immense political will. The 2030 Agenda must be our blueprint for our collective action.
Certainly a sobering assessment. The imperatives are really clear, and to reiterate what the narrator there said and the SG said earlier is that we need greater political will. We hope the heads of state and government are watching. If you've just joined us, this is the 2020 SDG Moment. A warm welcome to our viewers from around the world. We now know that from a global perspective, we are moving too slowly to achieve the goals by 2030, and that there are varied but considerable challenges in each and every region. At the same time, our last two presentations also echoed the words of the Secretary General: transformative change is possible. Let's turn now to a presentation about the kind of interventions that are urgently needed to bring about that transformation, based not on theory, but on smart policies and actions that are being advanced by governments and stakeholders around the world. I now have the pleasure to introduce an interactive presentation by the leaders of three key entities of the UN Development System, the administrator of the UN Development Programme, and the executive directors of UN Women and the UN Environment Programme.
A crisis can change the world from one day to the next with tragic consequences. The choices countries make today can lay the foundations for a better future. COVID-19 demonstrates that bold choices and action, which seemed unthinkable before, are possible. We have unique opportunity to transition towards a fair, equitable, and sustainable future. This means tackling poverty and inequality, climate change, and strengthening gender equality, which also sits at the heart of the 2030 Agenda. Inequality is exacerbated by COVID-19. 96 million people are at risk of falling into extreme poverty, widening the gender poverty gap. Critical investments in social protection can help the 4 billion people without access to be more resilient to the effects of the pandemic. Climate change is a threat multiplier, disproportionately affecting the poor. 24.9 million people were forcibly displaced across 140 countries in 2019. because of nearly 1,900 mostly climate-related disasters. They are counting on collective action through Paris Agreement to reverse greenhouse gas emissions. Countries with higher female parliamentary representation are more likely to sign environmental treaties. When women are involved in peace processes, the agreements are more inclusive and durable. But change is too slow. At the current rate of progress, it will take 100 years to close the gender equality gap. Governments and partners have choices that, if correctly combined for the context of each country or group, can translate into a lifelong investment in equality and sustainability. Making those choices starts with commitment to tackling the complexity of human development.
Excellencies, Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, it's good to be here with you in our UN headquarters, speaking live to the world about this SDG moment. The 2030 Agenda is a universal agenda for humanity, guided by the vision, or as Ola said, our imagination of a sustainable and fair world. But change, as the animation lays out, has been too slow. And now COVID-19 has exposed the implications of tattered safety nets, gender inequalities, and disregard for our planet. The pandemic is a clear warning. Recovery from crisis cannot be driven by a zero-sum game of economy versus environment or health versus economy. Rather, this once-in-a-generation chance to set things straight. And I'm hopeful that this ambition will be met. Over the next 10 minutes, we will tell you a story of what it means to leave no one behind, to put the dignity of every person at the center of building just, sustainable societies and economies. The pandemic is compressing the time it takes to make incredible progress in the face of terrible adversity. And it is shining a light on what has to be done. Together with my dear colleagues Pumzila and Inga, we will explore the courageous choices and policy innovations countries are making right now across the world to tackle the systemic challenges of poverty and inequality, gender inequality, and climate change. Advancing human development means creating opportunities for people through jobs and sustainable economies, but also eradicating the multiple dimensions of poverty and reducing inequality. To achieve this, social protection is an important investment, creating access for everyone to quality basic services, including universal health care. Before COVID, approximately 4 billion, yes, 4 billion people did not have access to social protection. Building people's resilience against vulnerability, risk, and deprivation, and helping them to get on their feet if they falter, defines social protection in the 21st century. This is crucially important given the expected reversal in human development for this year. Consider Colombia. Over the last 20 years, Colombia implemented an integrated social protection system, and it has delivered one of the fastest reductions in multidimensional poverty in the world. When COVID-19 hit, Colombia nearly doubled the number of households receiving social protection benefits in a matter of months. They did so by harnessing the power of digital platforms and modernized financial regulations. The results are expected to mitigate an increase in poverty by almost 5 percentage points. Colombia is not alone in scaling up these innovations. Togo, for example, built a digital cash transfer program from scratch in just 10 days. It now serves 12% of the country's population. Pakistan expanded an existing social protection program by 16 million households, and it now benefits almost half of the country's population. Three things help drive action on social protection. First, go beyond income, to understand who to target, to know who is suffering most or risks falling into poverty. Second, create fiscal space to invest in social protection. And as UNDP found, a 6-month temporary basic income would require only 1/3 of what developing countries owe in external debt payments just in this year 2020. Creating fiscal space also means phasing out expenditures that no longer make sense, like fossil fuel subsidies, as my colleague Inga will speak to in a moment. And third, make digital the default. The pandemic has shown the power of digital solutions to scale quickly, but also the urgent need to close the digital divide that still affects half the world's population. From expanding social protection to upending gender social norms, as my colleague Phumzile will speak to next, social protection is an opportunity for generational change. Thank you.
Thank you, Akim. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. As we celebrate this landmark agreement, COVID-19 threatens to undo the gains made on gender equality over the past 25 years. Women's economic security is in jeopardy. Gender poverty gaps are widening. Gender-based violence is resurgent, and girls' education and maternal health are threatened. In 2021, it is expected there will be 118 women in poverty for every 100 poor men globally, and this could rise by 2030. This would be a stunning reversal for the SDGs. But this kind of backsliding is not a foregone conclusion. With bold policies to boost women's economic empowerment, we can shift costs and accelerate progress instead, whether it is through policies to increase women's employment, including to support skills development and gender equality in science, technology, and innovation, services to support care to reduce women's load or to respond to violence. Countries recognize women's potential and are showing the way. In 2015, Uruguay put in place a publicly financed comprehensive care system for children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. As a result, Uruguay is today one of the leading countries in childcare provision and employment rates for mothers. There are other examples. Georgia and South Africa are supporting women's businesses. Morocco is assisting women's cooperatives. Japan and Sweden have policies to promote equal pay. In Australia, the government is leading the way to boost women's equality in STEM. The UN system is taking these policy insights to support countries on similar pathways. Societies benefit when women can rise to opportunities. A profound transformation of economies is required for a just, sustainable future where women are at the centers. Countries need to invest in care services, education, and skills that will be a backbone of the economies of the future. My colleague, Inga Anderson, will explore the climate action investments needed to transition from a grey to a green economy.
Thank you, Phumzile, and thank you, Akim. Climate action will help achieve multiple goals across the 2030 agenda. The NDCs are at the very heart of translating climate ambition into action. As we mark 5 years of Agenda 2030, we are contending with the warmest climates on Earth. We cannot afford a future powered by fossil fuels, which are the largest single contributors to climate change. We committed in Paris to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. But projections show that by 2030, we will produce 120% more fossil fuel This dangerous path could see us double emissions by 2050. As countries construct their response plans, they cannot afford to take their eyes off the relationship between people and planet. As we phase out fossil fuels, we need clean and sustainable sources of energy. Renewable energy is part of the solution, and we are making progress around the world. South Africa invested $20 billion in renewable energy over the last 8 years. Renewable energy creates jobs. It could create 42 million jobs by 2050, with higher gender parity as compared to traditional energy sectors. And nature's infrastructure holds answers to sustainable, inclusive recovery that drives down poverty and upends gender inequalities. Consider the Sahel. Bordering the Sahara Desert, the Sahel is on the front lines of the climate crisis. The ambitious Great Green Wall, a collaboration from Senegal to Djibouti, contributes to 15 of the 17 SDGs. It's restoring ecosystems, accelerating growth and jobs, and combating climate change. The Secretary General has set out 6 steps for climate action. We need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, redirect finance from nature negative into nature positive flows, invest in renewables, and as we phase out fossil fuels, we need clean and sustainable sources of energy. We need to invest in nature. Excellencies, COVID-19 is a challenge of our lifetimes, but it is also an opportunity to correct conditions that brought us here. A green, inclusive recovery provides a policy space to make long overdue changes to our socioeconomic architecture and to rebalance our relationship with the environment. We must head off the long-term consequences of digital exclusion, including for the millions of children who are left without access to online education. We must offer decent jobs that also protect our natural assets, especially for our young people who will bear the burden or the fruit of the choices that we make today. We must rely on international cooperation and frameworks to steer our paths, and we must do whatever it takes to contain the virus without taking our eyes off the future we want. The world was ill-prepared to confront the devastating effects of COVID-19. We're not here today because of the virus. We're here in spite of it. Our choices matter. This is our decade of transformation.
Thank you to all our presenters of the last segment and for the animators and producers behind the amazing visualizations. We have heard that progress has been made, but we have so much more to do. We have seen the possibilities that lie ahead, and we know that to grasp them, we need to make bold choices. In the next segment, we will hear directly from heads of state and government and the leaders of regional organizations about the gaps they face in their SDG implementation to accelerate progress over the coming decade. To begin, we will hear from the person who presides over the global town hall of our global village and the ultimate home of the 2030 Agenda. I have the great honor to introduce His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the 75th session, the historic 75th session of the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, sir, you have the floor.
His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Ms. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, His Excellency Ambassador Münir Akram, President of ECOSOC. Excellencies, I'm honored to address you all today at this inaugural SDG moment. When mandated by the General Assembly, few of us could have known the setbacks the pandemic would cause the SDGs and the urgency that this would present us today. In less than a year, we have seen social and economic damage on a scale not seen since the Second World War. At least 71 million people are being pushed into extreme poverty. Approximately 270 million people face acute food insecurity. And an estimated 1.6 billion children and youth have seen their education threatened. Allow me to be frank. Progress on the SDGs was inconsistent and, of course, well before COVID-19 shook the world. The pandemic has unveiled the dangers inherent in today. It has reminded us starkly of the need to act. Not since the United Nations was founded has the world required such levels of collaboration, cooperation, and dialogue. These are the moments for which we were built. It is for this reason that I have included the SDGs and Decade of Action amongst the priorities of the 75th session. Halting to the spread of COVID-19 and regaining progress against the SDGs must be our collective priority. Countries in special situations, including the least developed countries, should be prioritized. It will not be easy, but the SDGs themselves provide us the very blueprint needed to recover better. We must look to 2020 with renewed vigor. The pandemic may have set us back, but it can also be the board from which we bounce back further and faster. As countries across the globe embark upon socio-economic recovery plans, let them be guided by the SDGs. Let us choose a more equal, more green, more resilient world. On this, I'm confident that UNDP and the broader UN system, under the guidance of the Deputy Secretary General, are accelerating efforts at the national level. As I open this segment on SDG gaps and plans, I urge heads of state and governments to share the plans and measures to innovate and inspire greater action through transformative pathways over the course of the decade. I support the efforts of the Secretary General in the reform agenda and appreciate the timely and far-reaching reforms of the United Nations development system. UN country teams are key players in this crucial effort and must continue to support national efforts and priorities, particularly around COVID recovery and the SDGs. The Decade of Action may have started with a global emergency and a dramatic setback, but we can choose to let this strengthen our resolve. We can choose to go forward with unwavering ambition to achieve the SDGs while overcoming the COVID-19 pandemic. Let this be the moment that we make the choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good luck as you preside over what will be a historic virtual UN 75 high-level week next week. Regional cooperation between countries has proven to be a critical driver of peace and prosperity over the last 75 years. In this spirit, we will now hear from the leader of the Secretariat of one of the crucial regional organizations, His Excellency, Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission.
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, Monsieur le Secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies, distingués invités. L'année 2020 marque le début de la décennie d'action et de mise en œuvre des objectifs de développement durable lancés par les dirigeants du monde lors de l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies dédiée à cet effet. C'est également le début de la décennie à parcourir avant la fin de l'année butoir des ODD en 2030, soit 3 ans avant l'expiration du premier plan décennal de la mise en œuvre de l'agenda africain, l'agenda 2063. Après 2 décennies de croissance économique soutenue et d'amélioration significative dans le secteur social, le continent était sur la bonne voie pour transformer ses impressionnantes performances économiques afin d'atteindre les niveaux de développement social observés dans d'autres régions du monde. En effet, le continent s'apprêtait à prendre les mesures idoines pour opérationnaliser la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine et accélérer les rythmes de mise en œuvre de l'agenda 2063 et des ODD. Cependant, il vient d'être interrompu dans son élan par l'une des pandémies les plus meurtrières que le monde ait jamais connues. Ce qui a commencé comme une simple crise sanitaire s'est rapidement transformé en l'une des pires crises économiques, sociales,
social and humanitarian crises, and is in the midst of undoing all of the significant economic progress achieved thus far. Since the very beginning of the appearance of COVID-19 in Africa, the African Union created a COVID-19 response fund and convened several high-level meetings. There was a heads of government and head of regional economic commissions conference. There was a conference with the ministers of finance, employment and agriculture, and all of these stakeholders worked together to better coordinate the continent's strategy to respond to the pandemic and the continent's strategy in terms of resource mobilization. Africa also implemented a panel of special envoys to aid countries in their efforts to negotiate the treatment of African debt and the relief of African debt, as well as the mobilization of resources, both domestic and external. However, these efforts remain limited given the scope of havoc wreaked by the pandemic. In this regard, world solidarity is vital. The pandemic is a global challenge, and consequently, the whole world must work together as closely as it possibly can. We now, in the form of the pandemic, have a historic opportunity to build back better and restore the strength of the value of multilateralism. Africa has also witnessed the pandemic as an opportunity to transform a crisis into an opportunity. It's reshaped its development model, diversified its economies, and made them more resilient to exogenous shocks. The structural diversification of economies through the transformation of productive spheres has been one thing Africa's done. Africa's also added value to its value change and ushered in digitization. All of these endeavours should better enable Africa to harness greater benefits from African free trade areas. The implementation of these FDAs should increase intra-African trade to the tune of 15% and should produce between $15 and $20 billion in the near future. It should step up economic growth and create a number of jobs, including and particularly for young people and women. It should also step up the pace of sustainable development. The African Union calls for more solidarity, more equity, more justice, more humanity, so that together we can build a better world for us all. Thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the leader of the African Union Commission. Unlike its predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals apply universally because people are being left behind in every country, and because development is a constant process of change and improvement. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, we will hear from 23 countries across different regions. What we will see are the unique circumstances, starting points, and contexts in which each country finds itself. But we will also see a range of common and shared regional and global challenges. We will begin with 6 countries from across Africa. We have heard about the trends in poverty reduction, climate, and gender equality in Africa. from slowdown in poverty trends and economic growth to the existential threats of climate change. We will now learn how these trends translate into specific challenges of a group of countries from the region and the plans that these countries have put in place to address them. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government from Angola, Botswana, Nigeria, Seychelles, my country, South Africa, and Morocco.
Excelência, Senhor Secretário-Geral das Nações Unidas, Excelência, Senhor Chefe de Estado e de Governo, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. Saúdo todos os presentes com votos de muito boa saúde, principalmente no momento que o mundo vive uma profunda crise econômica, financeira e social provocada pela pandemia da Covid-19. O governo de Angola reafirma o seu compromisso de trabalhar pelos 17 Objetivos do Desenvolvimento Sustentável no quadro da Agenda 2030, intitulada Transformar o Nosso Mundo, para que os mesmos sejam alcançados no nosso país, com particular realce para a eliminação da pobreza extrema e a redução significativa dos níveis de pobreza multidimensionais até ao ano 2030. O primeiro objetivo do desenvolvimento sustentável foi definido como sendo a erradicação da pobreza, facto que ganha muito mais importância depois dos fundamentos da economia mundial terem sido fortemente abalados por este forte choque negativo provocado pela pandemia da Covid-19. O governo de Angola atribui uma grande importância às questões relativas ao combate à pobreza e à elevação do bem-estar e da qualidade de vida das populações. Por esta razão, dos 70 programas de ação que integram o Plano de Desenvolvimento Nacional de Angola para o período 2018-2022, 36 têm incidência sobre a meta da eliminação da pobreza extrema e da redução da pobreza multidimensional. Estes programas de combate à pobreza estão definidos com base nos seguintes eixos de atuação: as transferências monetárias, a inclusão produtiva ou geração de trabalho e renda, a ampliação das infraestruturas e da oferta de bens, a ampliação dos serviços sociais com destaque para a alfabetização, o ensino e a saúde, e o reforço da capacidade institucional, sobretudo no domínio da assistência social às crianças, às mulheres, aos jovens e aos idosos. Gostaríamos de destacar o início, a 30 de maio do corrente ano, da implementação de um programa de transferências sociais monetárias que irá abranger 1.600.000 famílias. Este programa, em parceria com o Banco Mundial e que se estenderá até o ano 2022, inclui um pacote financeiro equivalente a 420 milhões de dólares americanos. Numa altura em que, devido a restrições orçamentais e financeiras, a função pública em Angola não está a admitir novos agentes, aumentamos consideravelmente o número de profissionais nos setores da saúde e da educação. Foram abertas mais de 19.000 vagas para professores do ensino geral em 2018 e cerca de 10.000 vagas em 2019, totalizando mais de 29.000 vagas para o sistema de ensino geral só nos últimos 2 anos. No setor da saúde foram abertas cerca de 7.600 vagas em 2018, enquanto que em 2019 foram abertas 7.000 vagas, prefazendo um total de 14.600 profissionais de saúde. No domínio das infraestruturas para o Sistema Nacional de Saúde, o nosso país fez um importante investimento nos últimos 2 anos, tendo aumentado o número de camas disponíveis nos hospitais em 5.382 unidades. Foram inaugurados novos hospitais em várias localidades do país, aumentando-se assim a oferta dos cuidados intensivos de saúde. Tendo em conta a sua grande importância na economia de Angola, A produção alimentar familiar constitui pilar de enorme relevância nos esforços do governo de Angola de combate à pobreza.
Mr. President, let me start by echoing Botswana's appreciation for the convening of this high-level event, dubbed the SDG Moment. We find this initiative opportune as it has great potential to provide sustained impetus for SDGs implementation during this decade of action. Botswana, like many other countries, has been negatively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which came at a time when my government had just set out a transformative development agenda in line with the 2030 agenda to propel Botswana to greater heights. The unstable global economy has caused disruptions and fiscal constraints that exacerbated the existing national budget deficit. Our worsened fiscal position will curtail efforts geared towards SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. This could ignite negative ripple effects on the country's performance of other SDGs, given the interlinkages. It is indisputable that our ongoing efforts to develop high multiplier effects in job creation run the risk of being reversed by the impact of COVID-19. The small, medium, and micro enterprises are the hardest hit, as they lack the resilience to deal with the effects of the pandemic. Consequently, the purchasing power of households has been eroded, leaving many families looking up to government for assistance. Mr. President, Botswana, with her limited resources, has come up with the short-term COVID-19 economic relief package to support the economy and complement disease containment measures. The package covers interventions such as additional health expenditure, deferment of corporate tax on profit payable by firms, and a loan guarantee scheme to support access to bank credit by affected firms. Moreover, non-fiscal measures adopted include easing the monetary policy and introduction of additional liquidity measures for commercial banks to enable them to support economic activity. Botswana has also developed an economic recovery and transformation plan, which will complement the short-term economic relief package. Mr. President, my government is committed to closing implementation gaps to turn the COVID-19 crisis into a catalyst towards achieving the SDGs. As such, we have collaborated with the UN team in Botswana to develop comprehensive SDGs planning guidelines. The government will also develop an SDG financing strategy and its core institutional components through the design and implementation of an integrated national financing framework. This will strategically position Botswana to identify and leverage domestic and international public and private finance to support the realization of national priorities and SDGs. Botswana intends to collaborate with the international community to apply advanced Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies towards the implementation of her development agenda. Another expected impact is efficiency in spending, cost containment, and avoidance of wastage to effectively deliver public services within the public sector. Mr. President, let me conclude by reaffirming Botswana's commitment and readiness to doing her part towards implementation of our internationally agreed development goals, aimed at leaving no man, woman, or child behind. We thus remain steadfast and determined to build back better and faster. Thank you for your attention.
President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the government and people of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, I congratulate Your Excellency Volkan Bozkır on your election as President of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I would also like to congratulate His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, for convening the maiden edition of the Sustainable Development Goals movement. Nigeria is delighted to be part of this event, which affords us the opportunity as global leaders to reinforce our dedication to achieving the SDGs. I therefore commend the Secretary General for taking steps to place the decade of action on SDGs at the center of the crucial high-level week of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Excellencies, Nigeria has made good strides in sustainable development goals, domestication processes, as we have commenced the realignment of the national statistical system with the requirements and indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have developed a novel homegrown integrated Sustainable Development Goals model as an analytical framework for assessing how policy making can better address the indivisible nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. Nigeria has also set up a model private sector advisory group and an SDGs donors forum with a view to engaging critical stakeholders toward the attainment of the SDGs. I wish to recall that Nigeria presented its second voluntary national review on the Sustainable Development Goals to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum in July 2020. The second voluntary national review highlighted our efforts to meet Sustainable Development Goals targets on the critical issues of poverty and an inclusive economy, health and well-being, education and gender equality, enabling environment of peace and security, and partnerships. This was based on our current development priorities as captured in our Economic Recovery and Growth Plan 2017 to 2020, as well as our medium-term National Development Plan 2020 to 2025. Nigeria is also committed to mainstreaming the Sustainable Development Goals into our subsequent development plans. In this decade of action, Nigeria will implement unique initiatives aimed at accelerating the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Such initiatives include the realigned national statistical system to effectively track and monitor the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals on an annual basis. The Nigeria Integrated Sustainable Development Goals simulation model to support the domestication of the planning model across the 36 states, the integrated national financing frameworks for the Sustainable Development Goals, the scaled-up National Social Investment Program to reach more poor and vulnerable Nigerians in line with our commitment to lift 100 million people out of poverty within a 10-year period, and the engaging of all segments of the society for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Similarly, our National Assembly has established committees on Sustainable Development Goals. The National Youth Service Scheme is also ensuring that Nigerian graduates actively participate in the Sustainable Development Goals implementation processes by serving as SDGs champions at the grassroots. In addition, we have also strengthened our anti-corruption institutions to enable us more effectively combat illicit financial flows and recover its proceeds. Excellencies, in line with our administration's priority, Nigeria inaugurated the Total Official Support for Sustainable Development Task Force team in July 2017. The team was saddled with the responsibility of developing a new framework for measuring officially supported resources for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. However, the coronavirus pandemic has altered our socio-economic dynamics and threatened to derail our progress on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. To address this, we have rededicated efforts towards diversifying our economy, focusing on agriculture and the mining sectors. Having observed that policy incoherence and trade-offs pose significant challenge to us, we will pay greater attention to interlinkages and mainstream sustainability assessment into the annual cycle of our policy planning, as well as budgeting and the reporting processes. Going forward, we will invigorate the goal achievement process as a grassroots by engaging the services of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals ambassadors we appointed to support our efforts at the national level. We will also encourage more subnational authorities to appoint and train Sustainable Development Goals champions. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, let me conclude by reaffirming Nigeria's commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and other internationally agreed development goals. You can count on the support of our administration in our collective quest to achieve these noble objectives. Thank you.
Dear honorable delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this first annual SDG moment is a rallying call for us all. The SDGs unite us around a shared future threatened not only by COVID-19, but by the existential threat of climate change. This shared future is about more than just socio-economic progress. It is about saving lives. Last month, Seychelles celebrated the 250th anniversary of its settlement. Over these 2.5 centuries, a nation has been forged from a melting pot of continents, from the pain of slavery. A nation has been built on the spirit of unity in diversity. This is what Seychelles stands for. A small island developing state, conscious of our isolation, but also aware of our potential, a large ocean nation. Today, the fruits of our labor speak for themselves. The Republic of Seychelles presented its very first voluntary national review in July of this year as its blueprint for SDG implementation. Our successes were notable in areas such as education, health, as well as in environmental protection and conservation. As an island nation, we are inherently vulnerable to external shocks. Climate change underlines this vulnerability, coupled with a narrow resource base and associated challenges of resource mobilization, human resource constraints, and regional maritime security risk. While we have led the way in responding to COVID-19 with no cases of local transmission, the economic impact has been dramatic. For Seychelles, this has meant foregoing some of the hard-fought economic gains and adopting contingency plans focused on protecting our population. This is our foremost priority. I urge all our partners to review criteria currently being used to measure development and ensure that an appropriate focus on vulnerability is captured. The SDGs require us to look beyond GDP. They require us to invest in well-being of citizens. There is no better time in this decade of action to adopt a vulnerability index that can allow us to better target resources for development. The interrelatedness of the SDGs will mean that the COVID-19 pandemic will have systemic effects on our performance in almost all the goals. With an economy heavily reliant on tourism and services, the pandemic has dealt a blow to the livelihoods of thousands. As a global collective, we must also turn to nature to find solutions to the problems we face. In accelerating our economic development, we acknowledge the vast potential of the ocean and the blue economy as catalysts of transformative economic growth through which we all can benefit. We must recognize the true value of our natural capital to fight climate change. Seychelles' decision to protect over 1/3 of its exclusive economic zone is driven by the recognition that we all have a responsibility to solve this problem. In doing so, we will also create new economic opportunities that are anchored in the protection of nature. We need to turn the same urgency of response to COVID-19 to tackle climate change. In the teeth of the crisis created by COVID-19, we are proceeding with remedial policy responses, which will contribute towards bringing Seychelles back on track to achieving the SDGs. In March of this year, the government launched a flagship initiative, the Financial Assistance for Job Retention Scheme, which is catering for the salaries of businesses hardest hit by the adverse effects of COVID-19. A nation such as ours does not have unlimited resources to inject into the response to COVID-19. While we seek to diversify, we do not have a million options to choose from. However, we are determined to protect our people. We are determined to make this decade of action meaningful. Today's reality has put all of us to the test, and in the true Seychelles spirit, the people of Seychelles have risen to the occasion. My fellow SDG champions, despite the threat of the pandemic, we must remain focused on our journey to forge our way towards a brighter, more equitable, and sustainable future. Let us work together with unwavering resolve, leaving no one behind. I thank you.
Secretary General, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, South Africa welcomes this opportunity to engage on accelerated global action towards sustainable development. As we do so, we face the reality that the immense resources we have directed to fighting the coronavirus pandemic have severely set back our ability to realize the Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, this is an unprecedented opportunity to build back better and fairer. For Africa, the path we must take is clear. The UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a lodestar for transforming our world and the template for global cooperation and partnership. We must invest in our people. We must provide developing countries with the means to achieve the SDGs. We must ensure technology transfer and capacity building support. We must ensure that no country is left behind. We must also prioritize those countries with special needs and circumstances, including least developed countries, small island developing states, and countries in conflict or under occupation. Regrettably, the multilateral response to advancing sustainable development has experienced setbacks on many fronts. This has been in no small part due to the impact of the pandemic. Some countries have reneged on their multilateral commitments. It is our hope that member states will find common course in this ambitious, forward-looking and truly transformative global agenda. Our experience with COVID-19 has really demonstrated what can be achieved if we act and work together to address global challenges. In the face of the pandemic, African countries have acted with determination and resolve. The African Union is developing a comprehensive response to COVID-19, addressing the economic and social and environmental pillars of sustainable development. Working together as countries, as the international community, and with our development partners, it is within our means to meet the aspirations of Agenda 2030. It is within our means to eradicate poverty and inequality and to bring about greater economic justice and conserve our natural world for future generations. I thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، أصحاب السعادة، أتقدم بخالص الشكر للسيد الأمين العام على دعوته لعقد هذا الاجتماع رفيع المستوى حول أهداف التنمية المستدامة، وهو اجتماع ينعقد في وقته المناسب لتقييم التقدم المحرز.
Because we need to assess progress made in the implementation of these SDGs, and we also need to explore the ways and means of creating new impetus to implement them. This is a necessity imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused a socioeconomic and health crisis which is unprecedented and has made millions of human beings even more vulnerable. This crisis has also made the implementation of the SDGs more difficult. It has also, however, demonstrated the relevance of the Agenda 2030 and the centrality of the goals linked to health and social protection. Excellencies, the Kingdom of Morocco has made the SDGs a national priority. Recently, we submitted our second voluntary national review to the high-level political forum. In this report, we presented tangible progress made by Morocco in the following fields: access to basic services, fight against poverty, reduction of social inequality, women's empowerment, and investment in human capital and renewable energy. However, COVID-19 has had a serious impact on socio-economic development in Morocco, much like other countries around the world. So that we can fight against the repercussions of this pandemic, Morocco, under the directives of His Royal Highness Mohammed VI, a whole raft of measures, including a special fund to fight against the effects of the pandemic, strengthening the healthcare system, and providing the necessary support to the most vulnerable strata of society, as well as supporting the most affected businesses. On the Throne Festival in July 2020, His Royal Highness Mohammed VI presented a plan which is underpinned by the following points. It is for economic recovery, to inject the equivalent of $12 billion into the national economy, to create an investment fund to support the essential productive sectors, as well as the provision of universal health coverage. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Kingdom of Morocco, under the wise leadership of His Royal Highness, continue to meet its commitments to strengthen national development as in part of our partnerships, which keeps Africa at the heart of its concerns. In conclusion, we would also like to pay all necessary attention to Africa to strengthen its immunity against this crisis. And we also call on the United Nations to create a special fund to support the implementation of the SDGs in Africa. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government from Angola, Botswana, Nigeria, the Seychelles, South Africa, and Morocco. Next, we will hear from countries in the Asia and Pacific regions. From the megacities and successful development stories to the challenges of small island development states and the complexities of migration and conflict, the next group of countries are searching for a more inclusive and sustainable path and determined to overcome adversities. I invite you to listen now to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government of Lebanon, Palau, Nepal, and Samoa.
All right, so we come out of that 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly, where you had the UN member states today really adopting a declaration that's committing to a reinvigorated multilateralism in a world that needs cooperation and consensus. So our very own Sharon Bryce Pease there moderating that particular session. We've had a number of African leaders committing to this 2030 agenda for the sustainable development. President Cyril Ramaphosa there also said his part, saying that it is within our means to eradicate poverty and inequality, to bring about a greater economic justice and conserve our natural world for future generations. All right, so we'll leave it at that for now. Let us take a quick break here on SA Today. I will be back right at the top of the hour with the second hour of SA Today. Do stay with us.